Join us today for Cerebrivore, where the panel discusses British horror movies and the phenomena of horror movies in England to include the video nasties.
I mean, the Prime Minister made it quite clear yesterday that she was behind the bill and that the government was behind the bill and that she wanted the bill to pass through the House as rapidly as possible.
And this is taken from a meeting of the Video Recordings Bill Standing Committee. Those who trade in this filth are in the same class as peddlers of heroin and cocaine. They are murderers who are destroying the physical and mental health of many young people, and they are bringing such people to degradation and premature death.
MP Graham Bright.
I believe that research is taking place, and it will show that these films not only affect young people, but I believe they affect adults as well.
So lock up your dogs and join us for today's episode of Cerebrivore.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of pain and four paws. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? Let on the Cerebrivore, and I'll show them so much more. We'll leave your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. I'm your host, Jason, from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Today, I have an esteemed panel from across the pond that are going to help me explore the British, and we're also going to touch on some Irish horror movies, the video nasty phenomena. We're going to talk about folk horror, all kinds of great subjects. So just in the order they are on my screen, but obviously everyone here is equally valuable member of the panel. I have the crew from the Red Dice Diaries, John and Hannah. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Anytime we can get somebody that has actually appeared in a horror movie, John, we're happy to do that. I'm sure all of our viewers have seen Zombiehood and they're familiar with your work, but I'll link it in the show notes.
Yeah, or like 2 minutes of it.
And giving it more than the 1 star I did on IMDb.
We also have Spencer, aka Free Throw of Keep Off the Borderland. How you doing, Spencer?
I'm good, thanks. Good. Pleased to be back on Cerebrivore.
Yeah, we're pleased to have you back. And last but definitely not least is James, who's an active member of the Grognard Files community on their Discord and a horror film enthusiast. How are you doing today, James?
I'm good. Very happy to be in such esteemed company to talk about some films that I enjoy very much. So yeah, looking forward to it.
I am too. I think as a Yank, as somebody that hasn't been over, obviously doesn't live over there, and kind of looking in from my side, one of the more interesting phenomena is when you think about British horror or horror, over there, was the whole video nasties thing. And I don't know if any of you guys can maybe explain to anybody outside of, over here in America or in other countries, what that is.
So way back when, you could only get videotapes from your video rental store, or you purchased them. And in order to get tapes into the video rental store, they had to meet certain censorship standards, which, to be honest, weren't all that extreme.
No.
But, at the time, there was a lot of debate over what films should and shouldn't be allowed to view, how old people should be when they were allowed to see a film.
Yeah, because I think part of it was when videos first came out, because they were like a new technology. When they first came out, they weren't given the same sort of ratings that cinema was given. So people sort of like freaked out a little bit when the idea of like films getting into people's homes without ratings sort of came up.
This was it. The rating system itself didn't really exist in the same way that it does now.
Yeah.
And things like Jaws was a PG, and that terrified a lot of people's children. Rightly so, because Jaws should not be a PG. And so as things got more refined, it became less of a problem. But in the 80s, there were a lot of court cases where people wanted to get their film out as it was, and other people were like, no, this film's too horrific. We can't show it in our cinema. We can't put it in our video store. And then, of course, you had this whole black market develop around it, with people pirating films, passing them around at pubs, passing them around at youth clubs. That was certainly how I saw The Nightmare on Elm Street the first time I saw it. Someone gave me the tape at youth club.
Yeah, and the sort of idea at the time was the film certification board, I forget exactly what the name was, they had this list of films that were sort of unclassified or were deemed unsuitable, and through various means that became sort of known as this like video nasties list. And obviously there was a lot going on with the sort of political sort of climate at the time, people trying to seem like they were very much for law and order, so people were really pushing that.
Yeah, it was a lot of the same people that were involved in demonizing Dungeons and Dragons at that sort of time.
Yeah, one of the most prominent figures was someone who's called Mary Whitehouse, who was quite an infamous figure, who was incredibly puritanical, and she also was against a lot of, D&D is a good example, but also there was a lot of music. And this is a very similar time to when the industrial music scene was happening, and a lot of bands like Throbbing Gristle used like images of Whitehouse in their artwork, and there was actually one of the most extreme outfits of that era were called Whitehouse after her, and their album sleeves were literally just sort of William Burroughs style cut and paste obscenities on the cover of their sleeves. And yeah, so in terms of my experience of a lot of this stuff, it's actually come through music, because that's kind of one of my primary passions, and that was how I found out about a lot of this stuff, was through industrial music. And by the time, because I was born in '84, so I was kind of becoming aware of this in the mid to late '90s, but because these films have been prohibited, my experience of it was more, hey, here's a list of movies that you should check out. So it was almost like
very much.
And
when someone had a tape that was, this was banned in such and such, even if it's not banned in the UK, people were still like, oh, that's banned in America, I've got to see it now. Yeah.
and like John and Hannah were saying, tapes would get past dubbed copies, and also there were two markets in London at that point, Camden Market and High Street Kensington Market. And High Street Kensington is a very kind of posh area of London, but there was this amazing indoors covered market in an old department store. It's in the basement of an old department store, and both in Camden Market and Ken Market, I mean, I'm sure they regularly got busted by I think it was the same people that did the classifications, the BBFC, I think it's called, the British Board of Film Classification. They would also go and raid these market stalls. And I now work at the National Sound Archive at the British Library, and a similar thing would happen with people that were releasing bootlegs in those markets. The DTI, who were the people that dealt with pirate radio and bootlegging of films, they would confiscate all the bootleg records that were also sold in these same locations. So there was a thriving, during the late 90s, there was a kind of thriving, probably from the 80s onwards, really, a thriving scene of kind of bootlegs of both music and these kind of videos coexisting in these kind of slightly more niche spaces. And that was my first experience of these so-called video nasties.
Yeah, I think I probably had a sort of similar but sort of like opposite end sort of experience to yourself, James, where I got into a lot of the music I now like things like Motorhead and stuff like that, because they had a lot of artwork on their album covers which had that very sort of like gothic look to them, which reminded me of some of the horror films I was watching, and I was like, oh, I could give this a listen and see what that's like, and then ended up liking a lot of those bands later on. But yeah, like I said, the video nasties, at the time as well, the people who were trying to get into government or stay in government, I forget the exact landscape at the time. There was a lot of, I suppose, if you're being polite, you might call it civil unrest in the UK, sort of at the time. Sure. And the people in government were very much trying to make it say, yes, we are the party of law and order, and sort of stamping down on these evil films that are going to corrupt our youth and brainwash our children was a very easy win to sort of make it look like you were doing something. And of course, the media got hold of this at the time, and they were like, oh, if your children watch these films, they're instantly going to turn into mad axemen and start killing people. And it, like a lot of things, it sort of snowballed out of all proportion, which, as we said, ironically ended up having the opposite effect, where some of these like little films that probably people wouldn't have bothered with, these little budget films, people were like, oh, I've got to see what the fuss is about.
Well, this is the other thing for me with Video Nasties. All of them were so built up in my mind before I got to see them that they were just so disappointing.
Yeah.
I pulled up tier list and went through the Video Nasties list that they've got on there to just like see, are there any that I could recommend? No. Out of a list of 76 films, there were only 3 that I'd even consider watching again, and one of them was Evil Dead.
Yeah, and to be fair, that's saying something if even we won't watch most of them, because we watch and like some rubbish.
Oh, we watch some trash horror.
So Spencer, we haven't heard from you yet. Let's let Spencer weigh in here. He's being polite.
Yeah. I mean, I've obviously I echo the experience. I was born in 1970, so I was a teen when the whole kind of video nasty thing blew up, and it was. What's interesting was it was kind of triggered by the advertising, because they were kind of hyping these films up as containing stuff that you've never seen before, and you know, this almost calling themselves out of being stuff that should be banned. And unfortunately, rather than that being sort of selling the film, it caused the authorities to kind of crack down and actually make stuff illegal to possess. So it's sort of that really backfired. It's funny, even though I've lived through that era, I'm a big horror fan, but I've got quite an active imagination, and I shied away from watching horror for quite a while until I was sort of in my later teens. And I'd get a great kick out of going around to there was a local video store, very, very small store. All the tapes were out the back behind the counter. And the shop consisted of like some ring binders with laminate sleeves with the film covers in. And I would love flipping through those horror movie covers and just looking at the stills. And the result of that these films were far better in my imagination than they ever were when I actually got the courage to sit down and watch them. You know, so that was quite disappointing when you finally got around to see these things that you'd really built up in your mind.
Sure. So I don't want to linger here too long, because we have a lot of great movies to talk about, as opposed to, you know, shock movies, right? But I guess the final thing I do want to hit on, though, my understanding, and I don't know, and James might be a better place here to answer this, but is that if a film doesn't have a classification, an official government classification, it can't be sold by retailers over there still. Is that the case? Because my understanding, there's still movies that.
I think that certainly was the case. Yeah. I mean, we were kind of discussing before the call, obviously with the advent of things becoming available online, it's far less of a problem, but that certainly was a massive problem in terms of, getting these things. It's almost the equivalent of a book having an ISBN number. If it doesn't have a rating, it basically can't go on the system. And I don't doubt that, like the places I was mentioning earlier, like High Street Ken Market or Camden Market, they didn't care about that. But even the independent video shops, it was funny, amazing hearing Spencer talk about that, because there were, when I was a kid in the mid to late 90s, there were Blockbusters, but there were also independent video shops. And I had that exact same experience as Spencer, of spending, particularly on like long summer holidays, going into the video shop and spending hours just looking at the covers of videos. And as like Spencer said, and imagining what some of these ones, that, because 18, I guess, is the equivalent of the US are. And I would spend ages looking at the covers of these 18 videos and imagining what they were. But then, like Hannah was saying, eventually I would see like Driller Killer and be like,
not disappointing, isn't it, that one? It's such a good title. It's such a great poster.
Yeah. I do think, actually, because I looked at the list because I knew we were having this discussion, and one thing that does unite a lot of the films that are on the list are, regardless of the content, they definitely did have shock factor titles, like Cannibal Holocaust. They were exactly the kind of thing that would have been in Mary Whitehouse's Corsairs, based on the title alone. Yeah.
Right. Now those that do have ratings over there now still have cuts in them, like they cut out a lot of the animal. There's a lot of animal violence in those movies. In the Mondo movies, the Italian Mondo movies had a lot of animal violence and things. the cannibal movies all had that. I guess the last thing, but before we move on, because I kind of equate this in my mind to like the idea of the martial arts issue, like the idea of banning, depiction of nunchucks and things. Is that still a thing over there, or is that changed now?
Oh, the Ninja Turtles can't have nunchucks.
Yeah.
I'm honestly not sure. We have some weird censorship rules, but then from our perspective, you guys have some weird censorship rules, and we only really notice it from, when it trips up.
Yeah, it's easy to notice from the sort of outside looking in, I think, because obviously, but for us, it's just sort of like what there is, and especially now when you say you can get hold of everything so easily on the internet, whereas back in the day, if something was on this video nasties list, unless you could come across like an imported copy or sort of like a dodgy sort of under the counter copy, you really couldn't get hold of it. And that's what we were saying earlier, you sort of you built it up in your mind probably far more than the video itself was actually worth.
Sure.
I don't think we're anywhere. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go on, Hannah.
I was going to say, I don't think we're nearly anywhere near as strict on like sex content or swearing content as American censors are. But as far as violence goes, I'm really not sure. It depends on the film.
Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah, we're over here. The violence isn't that big of a deal, but yeah, you throw sex or whatever, Americans are or at least the censors are prudes. We still have that, that Puritan strain that's lasted and continued on. Go ahead, Spencer. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say that back in the day, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were known as the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, because they weren't even going to use the word ninja. So, I mean, that's obviously, we've moved on from that, thankfully. But I just wanted to point that out.
Right. So
the only other thing I was just going to quickly mention, dwelling on the video nasties, that I do remember contemporaneously was there was a fairly horrific real life child murder, a guy called James Bulger, and I remember at the time the movie, and I think it was very similar to the situation with D&D in the I forget the guy's name now. Yeah,
they blamed it on Child's Play 3.
Exactly. Yeah. It was a very similar thing. But apparently then, once they'd kind of investigated, it had no actual effect. But in the press at the time, it was pegged on Child's Play 3, yeah.
People were desperate then to find a reason for why those two 10-year-olds took that toddler out to that train track and did what they did with him. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And you can understand people not wanting to think about that kind of thing and being upset at the idea of a film that seems to replicate it.
Yes, it's one of those things where, when something horrendous happens in like real life, it's often very difficult to like pinpoint something and say, oh, actually, this is the one cause of it, because life's more complicated than that. But people want to find somewhere where they can put their anger or their blame. So a lot of times with like these video nasties or like horror films or stuff like that, they become like an easy scapegoat for that sort of thing.
Very much like the towers getting edited out of the Spider-Man poster in 2001. Everybody knew it wasn't about that, but some people just didn't want reminding of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they in '92 they made a movie. I don't remember if it's exactly about that, but effectively about that case. It's called Mikey. That I don't believe it has a certificate. It's never been given a certification over there. Obviously, you can watch it online if you have a VPN or something. Tubi has it on over here right now, the channel, streaming channel Tubi. But and things like that are under, it's a tough thing because you don't want to rub it in families' faces and rub it in that. And definitely you see, we had that over here after the Manson family, the tape murders and stuff. You had a rash of films jumping in on that, trying to capitalize on that publicity. So it's a tough subject.
Didn't they do a series on like Netflix or something about one of the sort of famous American serial
They did something about Dharma not long ago, and everybody was talking about how sexy the actor was instead of how horrific the actions of the real life person was.
That serial killers are one of the over here that for some reason. Well, I don't think that's just over here. for people seem to have fascinations with with these horrible
people like true crime. It's a thing.
Yeah, I much prefer horror film. My wife, she'll watch true crime shows and all this, and I much prefer to watch horror movies, the things we're talking about today, because it's not real, but I enjoy it for the special effects, or I enjoy it for this and that, which is why I like the older ones.
I think the whole thing with like true crime, again, very similar to like horror. It's because you are several steps removed from what's going on, and it's obviously a fake version of what happened. It's not the real version. So in a way, it's that similar thing in a horror film where you're seeing something horrific happening, but you're watching it from the safety of like your living room. You know that it's not going to actually harm you, so you're sort of removed from it, but you get a sort of glimpse into that sort of like darker territory without actually having to go fully into it.
Sure, definitely. So speaking of darker territory, let's switch and start talking about some films themselves, some actual good films, some things we'd recommend. So, and I'm kind of going to go around the room. When you think of, let's say, homegrown horror, be it from from Britain or England, geography wise, but films from over there, what do you think of? What are some of your favorite movies, or movies that maybe don't get enough press that should get press? Why don't we switch order this time? We'll hit Spencer first and then come back around.
So obscure, something more obscure. I don't know, because the first sort of British movie that sprang to mind is Hellraiser, but obviously that's quite well known. I'm a big I do like the Ben Wheatley stuff, Kill List and Field in England. Sightseers is fantastic. Well, it's a comedy horror, really. But one thing that springs to mind that I only saw a few months ago from 2013 called Borderlands, The Borderlands, and it's almost like a found footage film, and I know you're not a big fan of that, Jason, but it's basically some people investigating a supposed miracle in a church, or something going on in a church in a small village, and these guys turn up with all this like film equipment, trying to capture these events on tape. And actually, it really surprised me. It's quite a low key thing, but I really enjoyed it, and I don't really see I've not heard anyone else speak about it at all. And it had a real kind of quite a shock ending that I really enjoyed, but I can imagine some people might I don't know, it might throw some people off, but I really enjoyed it.
Okay, it's a good recommendation. James,
I can't think of the director or the actors in it, but
yeah, we'll list it in the show notes. Go ahead, James.
Yep. Yeah. So when I chatted to you about doing this, Jason, I spent the last sort of couple of weeks revisiting stuff I'd seen, and kind of like also watching a whole bunch of stuff I hadn't seen, and kind of beginning to kind of group things in my head. And I've always been a big fan of, I mean, I've watched Hammer and I enjoy it, but I particularly enjoy folk horror. And when I was kind of looking at the films I'd seen and trying to factor in some of the ones I'd watched more recently, I managed to come up with these kind of three groupings of kind of folk horror from what I sort of view as the kind of the halcyon period of the very late 60s into the 70s. And there's obviously the big three that everyone knows, which is Witchfinder General, The Wicker Man, and Blood on Satan's Claw. But sort of leaving them to one side for now, because I think those are films that most people would be kind of aware of, and I'll happily discuss them. I think they're all really interesting, and they embody a lot of the real, the meat thematically of what a lot of the kind of folk horror films are. But the kind of the little groupings that I came up with are, the the first strand are films that were released as part of the BBC's Play for Today strand. And Play for Today is super interesting. And in my previous life as some kind of a journalist, I actually wrote an article about Play for Today, which I'll include in the links that I've sent to Jason. These were basically, for people not from the UK, it kind of ran from the very early 70s into the 80s. And these were plays that were shot like films, but shown on TV. So it kind of had all three things going on. And basically a lot of people that people would have heard of, whether it's writers like Ian McEwan or John Osborne, or most of the really great British directors of that era, like Alan Clark, Ken Loach, Mike Leigh, Lindsay Anderson, they all cut their teeth on Play for Today. And it was a real wide variety of shows. Some of the really well-known ones are Kathy Come Home, which was an early Ken Loach that had a huge impact on the perception of homelessness in the UK. The original version of Scum, which, going back to our earlier chat about video nasties, the original version was actually canned and not shown for a great many years. And I actually interviewed Ray Winston for that piece about the original version, which was cool. And the original version of The Black Stuff, which gave rise to the series Boys from the Black Stuff, which is another kind of classic kind of British kitchen sink, working class realist film, like really amazing, worth checking out. But there were three films in the Play for Today strand that are definite in, as far as in my personal canon, I see as definite folk horror films. The first is Robin Redbreast from 1970, which is directed by James McTaggart. The second, which is one of my all-time favorites, is Pender's Fen, which is written by David Rudkin, and it's kind of, I won't go into spoilers too much here because we could be here all day, but it's essentially like a kind of a coming of age drama, and the main character is a vicar's son, and he kind of endures these incredible visions of England's pagan past. And it also has a soundtrack by the BBC's Radiophonic Workshop, which, as I mentioned, that's kind of my background, is sound. And most people probably know the Radiophonic Workshop because they did the Doctor Who theme music. Yeah. That's kind of what they're most famous for. But they did do various bits of sound for TV, and several of my real favourite kind of folk horror that was on TV. So Quatermass and The Pit, which I'll talk about in a sec, as well as Pender's Fen, they did the soundtracks for, and those are both obviously kind of very affecting. And the final kind of Play for Today film is Red Shift, which is from 1978, which is based on a novel by Alan Garner. And it's really interesting. It's kind of set in multiple time periods. One is the English Civil War, one is Roman Britain, and one is the present day. And in the present day, as with many of these films, Blood on Satan's Claw being one of the best examples, something is found buried in the earth and things occur, basically. And then one of the other little strands I came up with was the work of Nigel Neal, who was involved in Quatermass, all iterations thereof. He also worked on The Witches, which I think in the US, Jason, you may know as the Devil's Own. And he wrote the screenplay for that. That was made by Hammer. And it kind of predates, but it's very in keeping with that. It's about a school teacher who returns to England after having been attacked by witch doctors in Africa. And then I won't go further because it gets spoilery, but yeah, it's really good. And Neil also wrote The Stone Tape, which possibly is my favorite of all of this, because again, it has this kind of sound element. It has the Radiophonic Workshop soundtrack. And it's directed by Peter Sasti, who did a lot of the Hammer films, Countess Dracula, Hands of the Ripper, and he was also involved in Doomwatch, which is another great kind of a folk horror thing. And Neil later on in the 70s also worked on something called Moraine, as well as a series called Beasts, which are also really good. And I have sitting in my Amazon cart a combined DVD of those. But they are both available on YouTube. And then my final little grouping, because I know I've talked for ages, is actually kids' TV shows, several of which I actually were kind of re-screened in the 90s. The first was The Owl Service, which again was based on a book by Alan Garner, which is amazing. But I was very disappointed to find out there's a megalithic stone in the TV show. And having done my research as a 40-year-old, it turns out they made it for the show. I always thought it was a real stone. I was gutted. If you've seen it, you'll know the stone I mean. It's in the intro. I was like, what? I can't believe it. But there was also Children of the Stones, which again is that's at Avebury, so those are definitely megalithic structures. and as with many of these things, if you disturb megalithic structures, woe betide you. And there are a couple of later ones that I wasn't aware of, but I have now checked out as part of this research. One was Company of Wolves from '84, which it's based on Angela Carter's Company of Wolves from the Bloody Chamber, which, if you've not read it, I don't think it's giving anything away. It's basically Little Red Riding Hood.
It's got Angela Lansbury as grandma.
It does, yeah. And also, as with many of these, available on YouTube. It's just amazing. And the final one, and then I'll stop wittering, is one called Moondial, which I'd also not seen. And it's from later in '88. And it's about a young girl, and she's staying with her aunt after her mother's injured in a car accident in this old stately home, and she encounters a moondial, and again things occur. So those are kind of my three groupings: the Play for Today, the work of Nigel Neal, and then these kind of children's, kind of early to mid '80s children's TV shows that, when you look back, it's like, how are kids allowed to watch this stuff? It's completely amazing. And then there's another strand, which I know you're familiar with, Jason, is the Ghost Story for Christmas, which is a lot of the M.R. James adaptations. That was another thing that really struck me. So I'll pass on to John and Hannah, because that was loads of yakking.
Well, I'm going to hop in really quickly before we pass on John, Hannah, because you mentioned folk horror, and we'll talk a little bit more about folk horror, but let's give our listeners definition.
For myself, it tends to be a lot to do with this conflict of cultures. So something like Wakewood is a fairly recent folk horror, where you've got like this couple from the city moving into the village, and all the people in the village are weird, and there's something weird going on. Really, that's about the clash of the city culture and the country culture in very much a similar way that The Wicker Man is. And if you think about like Children of the Corn, I'd class that under the same thing, that it's all about that culture clash, not necessarily with religion, but often with a lot of religion included.
Yeah, I think what Hannah says is absolutely right. For my sort of view, it can also be a sort of taking a protagonist that at the time the film was made is sort of a modern day protagonist, someone from the modern civilized, in inverted commas, world, who then is sort of taken out of their comfort zone, and they're put into a place, or they move to a place where they adhere to like older, or to the protagonist, sort of more bizarre traditions. And part of the sort of horror comes from that sort of idea that they're not in a place that's comfortable to them. They don't really know what's going on. So you often see, like say in The Wicker Man, they're very comfortable with their traditions. It's all normal for them. But from the view of the protagonist, it's some sort of heathen rituals, and you shouldn't be allowed in the modern world, that sort of thing.
Yeah, in The Wicker Man particularly, you've got this idea that it's okay to sacrifice this teenage girl. It's okay for these people to be out shagging in the woods. That's completely normal in their society. But you also don't see any homeless people in their society. And you never get the question, how would they feel about that? How would they feel about how our society treats its old folk, or doesn't educate its children about like safe sex?
Yeah.
It's about that culture clash and taking people out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best sort of, just in my opinion, obviously, but I think the best sort of folk horror for me aren't ones where they say, oh, we've got the modern world and this is good, and we've got the older world, which is bad. It's just when they say like, oh, it's the differences between the two, and like people from one sort of side struggling to interact with people from the other.
The Wicker Tree plays on that quite a lot as well. I don't know if anybody else has seen that. It's a fairly recent actual sequel to The Wicker Man, that features like an American missionary couple being sent to a very similar village. And again, it's about this sort of judging different people by your own standards.
And that was a cameo from Christopher Lee. I mean, what more do you want,
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all that. It's as well as the juxtaposition of town and country, and rationality versus tradition. I think what John and Hannah were getting at is totally true, because they often pose the question of what if the old ways were right, and what if the modern ways are not all they're cracked up to be? And that is like that's where a lot of the tension is, I think. And the films that don't demarcate that as a binary are often the more interesting ones.
Well, I think if you look at the protagonist as being our sort of window into the film in folk horror, most of us, I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of us, we lead fairly comfortable lives now. You know, we're not sort of having to like fight other people for like food or anything like that. We've got a roof over our head, most of us, stuff like that. But so sort of removing us from that sort of position where we're very comfortable in via the protagonist, sort of like we get a sort of a little taste of that sort of unsettling feeling where, as you were saying, James, we sort of re-examine our own surroundings and how we sort of live, and we're like, yeah, is it all it's cracked up to be? I mean, don't get me wrong, it's got some great advantages, but have we also lost something in the way we live now? And are there other ways that we could have potentially lived? And it's that sort of dissonance that adds an extra layer to folk horror for me, and that's why I find it so compelling.
Excellent. So, any thoughts on folk horror before we go on to John Hannah's picks, Spencer?
I did just want to ask James, is it possible to watch Redshift anywhere? Because that's one of the few things I've struggled to track down.
Yeah, all three of the Play for Todays have been reissued by the BFI now. So that one is now available as a DVD as well. Yeah, I don't know how easy it is to get online, but you could definitely get it as a DVD. The BFI have done a pretty amazing job with reissuing a lot of the stuff in this broad genre.
Yeah.
Excellent. So we're gonna and this list that James is talking about is going to be in the show. Well, it'll be linked to in the show notes, so you'll have access to it if you go to our show notes, as well as links to all the panel members, all that kind of thing. So, but John and Hannah, we've kind of put off your picks here. What? Let's hear some horror films from you guys.
To be fair, a lot unsurprisingly, because I've been banging on about folk horror, a lot of mine are sort of folk horror, and like I said, I've only picked a few, but a lot of the films I watch now, they tend to be Irish horror films, and that sort of came out. We had a period when we were watching films, and there just happened to be like a number of them that had the Irish Film Board like classification on them, and I watched 2 or 3 that we thought were really good, and then we've sort of sought out other ones. So one I'd like to sort of highlight is a film called The Hallow, although I believe it originated like a slightly different name. But that's basically, without going too much into spoiler territory, that's basically the story of a sort of city couple, got a young child. The sort of the male protagonist is he works with trees, sort of marking off like older trees so they won't be cut down. There's a big redevelopment going on in this area of like rural Ireland, and it all becomes tied in with the idea of sort of fairy or fae folklore, like fae living in the woods, and it sort of tries to tie in a sort of pseudo-scientific sort of rationale for how these legends might have arisen and how it impacts with. He sort of moves in originally, and a lot of the sort of people are like your stereotypical sort of local people from a small village who are like, oh, we don't like strangers around here, we don't like what you're doing. But it gradually, and they just thought, oh, they just don't like us because we're from the city. But it's gradually because, oh no, these people actually know about the dangers of this hidden world, if you want to call it that they're actually trying to sort of warn these people about, but in a way so they won't be ridiculed for their beliefs. But of course, by the time they realize that, as is the way with horror films, it's a little too late, and the whole thing unfolds sort of with some quite surprising twists and turns in it, which I won't go into, but highly recommend watching the Hallow. Yep. And then I think probably the other one I was going to mention, which is more of a monster movie and slightly a slight comedy, is the film Grabbers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a great movie,
and that's based around the premise of what would you do if you knew there were monsters attacking a smaller village, and the only way you could survive was to get incredibly drunk, with all the sort of comedic sort of flair and timing that goes with that. And you start off with it's a woman from WPC from the the sort of city, again coming to a small village. She gets paired up with the gruff sort of alcoholic cop who's got like a tragic backstory. They gradually sort of become friends, and they have the whole will they won't they sort of thing going on. But it's her sort of, I suppose, her sort of planning and her sort of ideas, when twinned with his local knowledge and his relationship with the people, is what actually ends up, even through the comedy effect of like, oh no, we've got to get drunk, let's hold a lock in, it's the only way to survive. But it's his local knowledge and his relationship with the locals that enables her plan to go into action. So in that sort of comedy, actually, it's like the two different worlds sort of coming together and sort of enabling them to save people.
It's a very folk horror premise of this WPC being sent to this like rural island to cover someone else's holiday shift, and the only other policeman there's a drunk. But then it subverts that as it goes along, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think the last one I'm going to mention as well is a film called Shrooms, which is based around again, a slight sort of comedy horror film, because we both enjoy like a good sort of horror comedy. And in this, it's basically some students go into Ireland, they buy some magic mushrooms, they're planning to go to a forest, as all like nonsensical people do. Oh, we don't want to freak out, let's put all our mobile phones in a bag and put them where we can't get at them if anything horrible happens. You know the drill. And then they all take these magic mushrooms, and the film itself is actually fairly simple, but what I liked about the premise is, if you look at it on a surface level, people start dying, strange things start happening. There's a talking cow in it, which I still laugh about thinking about now, because it's literally like a cow with like a cartoon face on it. But if you look at it on a surface level, you could just be, yeah, they've taken some hallucinogenic drugs, they've gone to these woods, accidents before them, they die, they freak out. That's it if you look at it at a basic surface level. But what I like about the film is that all the way through, it keeps sort of like suggesting that, like, well, is it just the fact they've taken these drugs, or is there actually something sinister going on? Have the drugs just allowed them to perceive something extra going on, or is it just twisting their perception and they're actually being stalked by a killer? And to my mind, it doesn't really give you like a full answer. It leaves it like a little bit sort of ambiguous to my mind.
It's not even 100% clear on whether they found the right shrooms in the first place. They certainly find some mushrooms in the woods and eat them.
Yeah, so I think those would probably be my three picks for. I don't know if you got any others you want to mention.
So I already mentioned Wakewood. That's quite a good sort of a dark British story. Couple who've recently lost a child go to this village where it's possible for that child to be brought back, but then the ramifications of it, and has he been brought back right? It's very sort of Pet Sematary, but in fact, it's a British Pet Sematary. That's the best recommend I could give for Wakewood.
And it's got Timothy Spall in it, who's a fantastic actor.
Well, yeah.
So.
There was one, because one of the things that I love about horror films is how you can watch a horror film from any era and it tells you a lot about that time, because one of the things that they're trying to do is show you normality before everything gets spooky. So one that really struck me as being like proper top drawer over the last couple of years was, I think it was called 1 Hour Call, which was made on Zoom during lockdown. And it's an hour long. Here's some people who are going to have a seance over Zoom, and here's the horror that continues. It doesn't appear to be called that. We'll find the name and we'll send it to you for your links.
Is it Host?
The Host,
yes. Host, yeah.
2020, yeah.
I thought that was really well done,
Yeah, that's one of my top recently. Other British horror that really stands out.
Say, I think as well, just to put in the thing about Host as well was, obviously it was sort of filmed during the lockdown. It's done entirely on a Zoom call, like the one we're in now as we're recording this. Mm-hmm. So I think the sort of horror of that, like you say, was that that was a very normal situation for like lots of people at the time. Oh yeah, we were all stuck in sat on Zoom calls. We can't go out. We're chatting to our friends remotely on the computer. So it takes that, and you're like, oh yeah, and it slides you into like, oh, it's just a slice of these people's normal life, and then the horror starts happening.
Yeah. And as I say, very much something with horror is how it tells you here's what's normal for people, so that you can see how normal life was then, or how people like to present normal life as being.
Well, like you say, like for people who've like lived through all the lockdowns and whatever, that was just a thing that happened. You know, that seems like a normal thing when we watch. I mean, not normal, but you know, I mean, it's something that people something that people experienced. So we sort of relate to it. But I do think, like, you know, maybe like 30, 40 years or whatever, if people are looking back and watching that film, like you say, we'll tell them something about the time period, because that they won't connect with it in quite the same way.
Go ahead, Hannah. Did you have another one?
I mean, I suppose I really ought to give a shout out to Zombie Hood, because it was great fun making it. I think that film sadly got lost in the editing process, but just as like a group of mates trying to make a film for, I think it was under £10,000.
Yeah. And
the quality of acting in it is top drawer. And I'm not just saying that because Adele's brilliant and I love her. My friend Adele.
I think as well from our perspective as well, because we were basically like extras in the film. I ended up getting like a small speaking part as like a bouncer in a club, because one of the people who was supposed to be turning up and doing it let them down, and they were like, oh, you look like a big chunky lad with a skinhead. Can you like read this one line for us? And the thing that I sort of got out of it is we basically did a scene in a standard zombie thing, a scene in a nightclub. Someone goes into the nightclub, goes into the bathroom, or they're a bit sick, they're obviously infected. They bite some people. It turns into a whole thing with loads of infected people like biting other people in this club. It's a whole scene. And we spent like pretty much an entire weekend sort of in a concrete lined, like freezing cold, sort of like cellar, sort of club level of this place. Filming. It
wasn't the entire weekend. It was 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. when we had to clean up so that they could open the nightclub.
Yeah, and I had a scene where I'm basically sort of like lying in the bathroom with like fake blood over me or whatever, and that seemed to take like forever to film, just like lying on this cold concrete, constantly having all this fake blood reapplied. I think the thing we got out of it is whenever I see like a film now, there's like a small clip with someone like covered in blood, I'm like, oh, I bet it took them ages to like get that. Then I have to watch a film now, I'm like, oh, I bet they were sat there for ages, like freezing off to death, like doing that. So I think it has given us a bit of an appreciation of like the lengths the extras and the actors have to go through to actually sort of make these films, even for very short periods of time.
I think the other thing that highlighted for me was particularly these independent films. They are a hell of a lot of work, and they cost a fortune in like normal people money.
Yeah.
So when they're made, they tend to be made with a lot of love and a lot of care, because people put so much into them. So even when the script isn't that great and the editing isn't that good, you can still watch it and see how much love's gone into it, how much care's gone into it. And if you have got a personal attachment to it for whatever reason, it really can make a difference. And that's true of so many horror films.
Yeah, I mean, I think as well, as you say, it's affected how we, I mean, this was like years and years ago now, but it's affected how we view horror films. Because like I said, we sort of laugh and we say we watch a load of like trashy like horror films where they're not great films, but I think, you know, we've got a bit more of an appreciation about, you know, someone's put probably an awful, even a small production, someone's put an awful lot of time into that with the videoing, the sound, the getting the script ready, like corralling the actors and all of that, even for a very small sort of film, even some of these like 1-2 people films that were done during lockdown and stuff like that, it's still a hell of a lot of effort. So I think we tend to sort of like try and look, even these trashy horror films, if you look through them, you can see like a couple of things that you probably think, oh, actually, yeah, that one scene was pretty well good. I like the score for this part of the film was like pretty interesting. So I think it's probably given us more of an appreciation for that.
So obviously these days with digital media and all, it's easier than ever to make movies. What was there a big independent film community out there, in the 70s, 80s? Were there a lot of independent films being made over there, or was that fairly rare, or was it?
I mean, I don't think in the 70s and 80s, certainly as digital media's taken off, it's become a lot more popular.
Yes, I don't think people would have had the equipment so much to do back then, when it was all vastly more expensive. Whereas if you've got a little bit of money behind you, you can get like a camera that will do, but by the sort of standards of the 1780s, amazing quality output for fairly little comparatively.
I think as well, looking at like the BBC compared to the British film industry, I think people would probably gravitate towards stuff for television rather than film.
Yeah.
It's because of the sort of the quality of what the TV was putting out.
Well, yeah, because when you think about some of the BBC stuff, a number of things on James's list, were TV shows, and a lot of the folk horror I came across, and not just folk horror, but different things. There's some really interesting things that have been shown on there. Now, we won't talk about Doctor Who out of respect to was it Nigel Neal? But if I understand right, because even though he did Quartermass and all that, he wasn't a fan of Doctor Who.
He wasn't a fan. Yeah, that surprises me. But
well, I was going to say, Jason, sorry to butt in. I'll say if you actually, and I'm sure Hannah will know what I'm talking about since I mentioned this, if you actually look at some of the sort of TV ads that were coming out in that sort of time, some of them have a pretty dark sort of tone.
The spirit of lonely water.
Yeah, indeed. This is the spirit of lonely water, where it was an advert to encourage kids not to go near ponds and streams in case they drown, and they chose to do that with a sort of spectral monk figure.
Yeah, I almost included that on my list.
Yeah,
it is
lonely
amazing,
water was terrifying.
I was like, can I really include a 2-minute ad? But it is amazing, and I've included on my list. There's a couple of public access films that were basically about being aware of like the train tracks.
Yeah,
that are like super creepy. And there's one called Apaches.
Where they're playing on the building side.
Yeah. And these were like public access films. I think I'm blanking on the name now, but on the Grognard Files relatively recently, they had that guy on that did the books about a lot of 70s and 80s TV shows, and he self-published them through Lulu. The name escapes me, but yeah, it is crazy but also going back to the funding aspect, because the British Film Council, I think, was only really established in the late 80s. And because it was prohibitively expensive to make a lot of stuff, the logical place to go was to the BBC, because there was at least some funding. So when the British Film Council was set up, that's relatively similar time, not that long after that film 4 comes around. So the ability for things approaching independent film in the UK became more possible in the late 80s, early 90s. And then it kind of like blossoms a little bit in the 90s. But really, because I went pretty deep kind of researching this, and a lot of these things would definitely be viewed as B movies, but they were made within the studio system. They weren't fully independent films. Shooting on film. I mean, for my work, I work at the sound and vision department of the British Library. And 90% of what we do is sound, but we do also have film, and we do transfer film. And even getting it digitized now is, it's amazingly expensive. I'm always blown away by the companies like Arrow and Vinegar Syndrome that are doing these reissues. The cost, some of the products they put out are expensive, but I can tell you firsthand from what it costs to basically just scan, because we don't do any remastering, to scan and remaster from a 16mm print is incredibly expensive. So when you see those prices that those Arrow and Vinegar Syndrome reissues, there is a reason, and I can tell you it is really expensive stuff. So shooting it and then transferring it, the whole process, so expensive, crazy expensive. So I think that's why there probably wasn't like an actual kind of indie scene until really the late 80s.
Right.
I seem to remember as well. You might be able to confirm this, James. You were talking about the funding. Is when the sort of national lottery became a thing. I seem to remember there was like a rash of films that received funding from like the national lottery.
Well, yeah, several of those Irish films that you've just recommended had national lottery funding.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge. My team, to this day, up until the end of March this year, we've had 5 years of funding from the lottery. So the lottery, gambling is a problematic area, but the lottery has funded both, as well as film, but sport as well, because I've got family who are very involved in sport, and they've done a hell of a lot of funding of film, music, sport. So that, again, that was that, and that, because we didn't have, I don't know, Jason may not know, but I remember the first night of the lottery. I can't remember what year it would have been, but it was in the 90s. I remember that, because we didn't have a national lottery till then. And then all of a sudden there was only one completely monopolized national lottery, and everyone was buying their lottery tickets from the same place. So overnight there was suddenly literally millions of people putting millions of pounds into lottery tickets every week.
I mean, obviously the sort of, when that first sort of came in as well, because there was a lot of sort of outcry and debate initially about whether we should even have that, because you say gambling's potentially problematic. So obviously they were keen to show the positive side of it, and the fact that these funds could be used to support sort of worthy causes and projects and stuff like that. So I think, I mean, they still are doing, but I think certainly early on when there was that massive influx of funds, they really sort of pushed funding various different things, like you say, some of which was film.
I mean, yeah, when I get a lottery ticket, I do tend to consider it as a donation to the Scout Huts and Horror Movies charity,
That's great. So as we kind of wind up, is there anything that we've touched on too lightly, or we want to, or you'd like to expand on? I guess we'll go with James first this time.
Well, I actually had two films. So as I said, I've been deep in this for the last 2 weeks. There were two films that I've actually not seen, and I was fascinated to hear if either of or any of you had seen them. And I think they almost fall into a very niche sub-pocket of witchfinder general exploitation. There's one 1970, The Bloody Judge by Jesus Franco, which has Christopher Lee in the Vincent Price role. And again, it's like Matthew Hopkins in Witchfinder General. It's based on a historical witchfinder, a guy called Judge Jeffreys, who was known as the Hanging Judge.
And that does sound familiar, actually.
Yeah, I think we've watched part of that, decided it was trash, switched it off, and put a different movie on.
Which is often do. Well, that's kind of reasonable considering it's Franco. So Franco is a very, very acquired taste, and even I haven't totally acquired the taste for Franco, right? But Franco is super prolific, Spanish filmmaker, super prolific, and that's a totally separate topic, well beyond the scope of this show. Although a lot of his films are still not. They don't have certifications over there at the moment, probably because they were nobody ever reapplied, after the initial, because they have bothered.
Is there one you would recommend?
Oh, I don't know. We'll do a different show on that.
I've just been looking up the IMDb page on the Bloody Judge, and I've definitely seen that, because I remember seeing that Christopher Lee with like the white judge's wig on.
What was your other film?
The other one is Cry of the Banshee from 1970.
I've seen that.
Which also has Vincent Price as a witch hunter in Elizabethan England. Yeah, and it's a very similar thing. So I have both of them as DVDs in my cart. So we'll get watched like soon.
A sort of Irish folk tales with possibly the Mary Poppins children in?
No. It's a witch hunter.
Sorry, I'm sure there is a film that's something Banshee that has.
Oh, there probably is, but no, I've definitely seen Cry the Banshee. I know for myself, I preferred Cry the Banshee to the Bloody Judge, but like I said, there is a lot of overlap between the two of them. But which I think was probably part of the reason I didn't finish watching the Bloody Judge, because I'd seen a few of the sort of Witchfinder General sort of like films, and they're all sort of like starting to blur into one. I was like, oh no, this is. I don't need to see another one of these films, which is the same sort of story. They all have a pretty sort of similar story in these corrupt Witchfinder General sort of stories.
And the other thing I'd mention which it had been on my list to watch for a while, but I subscribe to Shudder in the UK, which is good if you like watching these kind of films. And there's actually a 3.5 hour long documentary called Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched.
Yeah, we've watched that.
It covers all the British stuff, but the thing that was fascinating for me was there was so much non-UK based folk horror that looked really fascinating. So I have another separate list of all that stuff going on.
No, well, it's interesting, right? Because I mean, cut you off, John. Good.
No, it's all good. Go ahead, dude.
Okay. Well, I was gonna say it's interesting because when you watch some of these documentaries talking about folk horror and trying to pin down where it starts, you know, some of the ones I've seen actually go back to Hawthorne and go back over, the stories over here. Is although I'm sure these things build up equally in different places, right? But so folk horror kind of goes back quite a bit in literary genre to some degree, right? But there are a ton of films you could. I watched a Lord Shango, 1974, or Shango, Lord Shango, 1974 movie was a conflict between a family caught between the Christian church and an older ancestral religion, African American film from the 70s over here that would definitely fit in that folk horror genre without a doubt. And we have a number of those actually over here during the quote unquote blaxploitation period. So there, the folk horror is definitely something you see, and I'm sure as we get access to films from other countries, be it from Mexico or from Asia especially, there's all kinds of stuff coming out like Thailand and there's a whole market, a whole treasure trove of movies over there that we haven't seen yet or haven't had access to.
Well, yeah, I mean that's pretty much what I was going to say, Jason. I mean, I watched the same documentary that James was just talking about, and obviously a lot of the sort of UK or more sort of familiar sort of folk horror I'd seen, but they were also highlighting stuff from different countries and sort of even some of the like the American sort of folk horror stuff that I'd not heard of. So the great thing about that documentary is it was then a sort of a jumping off point for us going, let's try and find some of these other films. We sort of know we like a folk horror sort of vibe, and it's got a similar feeling, but it's an entirely new set of sort of legends and superstitions that's being pulled on. It's no sort of variations of the same ones that we sort of know pretty well.
James, any other thoughts, or were you?
Oh no, I mean the only other thing was I included at the very bottom of my list. There's a few books that I own. Jason knows a load of my stuff is in storage. So a couple of the books that were more about the films. There's one by Adam Scoville called Folk Horror: Hours Dreadful and Things Strange, and the other one I have is We Don't Go Back: A Watcher's Guide to Folk Horror. So those are two books specifically about folk horror cinema. But a book that I read during lockdown, so it would have been within the last couple of years, was called The Manningtree Witches by a young female English author called A.K. Blakemore, who grew up in Manningtree. And the real Matthew Hopkins and John Stern of Witchfinder General, the events that you see in the film, which are set in Suffolk, which is where Hopkins was from, that was actually conducted in Manningtree, which is in the north of Essex, just south of the Suffolk border. And it's closer. It's similar to The Crucible or something, but it's a fictional narrative, but it's rooted very heavily in her research into the documentary evidence of what actually Hopkins was up to in that area, and it's a really great novel. So if you want a novel that's fiction but rooted in a lot of the kind of stuff we've been talking about, that's a really great book. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, I'll try and crowbar like RPGs in here because I can't help myself. What can I say? But one of the things that sort of links the common threads of horror films, literature, RPGs for me are these sort of older legends, these superstitions, these folk tales. I mean, you guys are on the Zoom call now. If you see those like two shelves behind Hannah's head that are pretty crammed with books, those are literally just
like the other shelf.
Well, all of the other shelves are like RPGs, but those two shelves in particular are just sort of books about mythology, whether it be like ancient Egyptian, English, American sort of first settlers sort of mythology or Native American beliefs. All of those those sort of legends, those sort of like these folk tales, fairy tales, if you want to call them that, like Brothers Grimm's and stuff like that. All of that sort of imaginative imagery is one of the common threads for me, which links my love of horror films, of the fiction and non-fiction that I enjoy, and RPGs. It's sort of like viewing people's experience through a sort of like a mythic or like a legendary lens, and then people trying to understand things that they didn't have a frame of reference for. And so they created these legends around them. And in a very sort of small sort of way, when you do an RPG, you're trying to do that as well. You're trying to take the common experiences of like the GM and all the players, and out of it, you're trying to weave a story that sort of says something about yourselves, your characters, the world you're running it in, even though we're only like doing it for our entertainment. We're not in the same sort of setting, but it's like an echo of that old need to like tell stories about things, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And seeing as we've gone the RPG direction, I think Jason knows, but I don't know if John and Hannah and I think maybe Spencer knows. But I played a bunch in the early to mid to late 90s, and then had a very long break, and only really got into things in the last kind of year and a half, 2 years. So I've obviously missed a lot. So I'd be really interested to hear from you guys about systems, because I think a lot of this, Jason, came from your System Sunday review of Sabres and Witchery. It sounds like a really interesting system. And both Spencer and I are familiar with Feast, which is a sort of zine length system by Chris Bissett, who does Loot the Room and stuff. And I've never played Vaesen, but I am playing Vaesen at Grogmeet.
I was going to say that was one I was just about to mention.
I'm very excited about that. But beyond that, I'd be really interested to hear from you guys who've been playing this whole time, whether there are any other systems that you think can emulate the genre we've been talking about really well.
Well, there are a number. Or go ahead, John.
I was going to say, in terms of like Vaesen, I didn't buy a copy of it for like the longest period of time, and then they released a book called Mythic Britain and Ireland, which obviously I'm very interested in the folklore of like Britain and Ireland. So I sort of kickstarted that, got that book and the main book, which is based more on Nordic folk horror. But again, reading through the main book, obviously the premise of it is basically you are a member of a secret society who can see these folkloric creatures that normal people can't, and you're trying to sort of prevent them from disrupting the world. But again, it's the sort of clash between the modern world is now starting to impinge on the older world, and where they sort of cross, that's where you get the tensions, you get the problems, and your characters are like the problem solvers effectively. But a big part of the book for me is how it talks about these various different creatures, and they're very much the focus of the game. And they're all obviously heavily inspired by ancient myths and legends, which obviously, as I'm sure you gathered, is one of my interests. So.
Yeah, and I'm glad. So Spencer had stepped away just for a minute, but he just rejoined us. And as Spencer puts his earphone back in, we're going to ambush him. But so we switched to RPGs, and there's actually been an explosion of RPGs designed around folk horror recently. So James, you came back in the hobby at a good time. There's Casting the Runes, which is kind of built around doing MR James stuff. We talked about Vaesen while you were gone a little bit, Spencer. But there are a number of other. What's the one that? And I know Spencer probably owns all these. Yep.
Yeah, we've just been talking about that.
Yeah, but there was another one that we were. I remember talking to you on the forums about the Shivering Circle. Do you remember that one,
yes.
Spencer? Yeah,
I do, and that's very much ties in with Children of the Stones and that kind of stuff. It's it's contemporary, but it's very much about being in a small village, and it revolves around lots of kind of stuff going on just beneath the surface, and it's an interesting one.
Yeah, there's another one called English. Or go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention the D-Sanction as well, which is kind of Elizabethan.
Yeah, that's a good book.
Kind of monster hunting and stuff like that. I've also got a zine here by Chris Bissett called Beast, which is based on a couple of Ben Wheatley films, In the Earth and Field in England, and it involves mushrooms and being under the influence of spores and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say one I was going to mention, which I'm not sure if it really is like folk horror, but it's definitely a contender for like the RPG with like the longest title, if nothing else, and it's called "Do Not Let Us Die in the Dark Night of This Cold Winter," and it's weird because it's not really like a role playing game in itself. It's like built to be a sort of sub game for other role playing games, whether that be OSR games or sort of versions of D&D, whatever. And it's the basic idea is you are stuck in a village with X number of people. A huge sort of snowstorm, sort of winter has like hemmed you in, and the mini game is basically to marshal your supplies, your medicines, and stuff like that, and basically get the most number of people to the other end of winter until there's a thaw. And although the game itself is very sort of like matter of fact, it's all about the subsystems because it's designed to just be plugged into another game. I think that idea of being sort of hemmed in by the environment, there's no way you can run from it. It's a snowstorm. You can't pull out your broadsword and fight it. It's the weather. But that sort of idea of like, we've just got to like survive this somehow and sort of get it through it. That seems to like come up in like quite a few of the sort of folk horror films and the sort of folk horror things where there's these great sort of forces sort of acting against you, and you can't hope to, I suppose, leaning it into a bit of the sort of cosmic horror idea, you can't hope to do anything about them. All you can hope to do is survive through it in the best way you can.
Sure. So I linked, I don't have any experience with this product. There's something called English Eerie out there. I linked in I'll put it in the show notes. I linked in the chat, but I don't have any experience with that. But I guess the other things out there now, we mentioned Sabers and Witchery by Simon, brain farting here, the gentleman that did Barbarians of Lemuria. Why am I forgetting his name? Washburn, thank you. Yeah, Simon Washburn. But yeah, Sabers and Witchery is just it's swords and wizardry, but it's hacked to do these kind of things. Of course, you have Colonial Gothic, which definitely fits in this. Now, Colonial Gothic, as far as I can tell, isn't being sold as itself anymore. You have to buy the Zweihander version of it. The Flames of Freedom is how it's kind of been rebranded. And so that's interesting because you have that, and then you have various games that mix the supernatural with the Old West, the American Old West.
Like Deadlands.
Like Deadlands, or there's the
Weird
new
Frontiers.
one out. Weird Frontiers.
Yeah.
There's another one out that's being published by...
Frontier Scum.
Yeah, well, Frontier Scum. Although that's more of an acid Western thing.
But that's your old topo.
Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing about those, I mean, you have, because you definitely have your folk horror thing, and we saw this in Shadowrun as well, funny enough, the idea of your Native American or First Peoples, against the colonialists effectively. But, they end up being problematic because it's not typically First Peoples writing those parts, and you have somebody else, you have white guy number one writing what an Indian shaman does, right? So you potentially have issues with some of those, but you see that in those as well. Haunted West is what I'm thinking of. Haunted West is a new one that came out, and that was I believe that's the same author that did the Harlem supplement for Call of Cthulhu. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's the same gentleman that did that. And Haunted West has got, but it's being published by Artalzorian Games. The same would do with Cyberpunk.
I was going to say, I think we talked a bit earlier about in horror films, the sort of folk horror films, the idea that we're sort of given access to the strangeness of the sort of removed societies removed from us through a sort of protagonist who is like our window into the film. I think a lot of with these folk horror RPGs, we sort of have the same thing, but obviously we're like the players, we're directly involved. So we're still a bit removed. Obviously it's all imagery, of course it is, but we can take more of an active part in sort of exploring these, to us, sort of strange or removed societies. We sort of become the sort of protagonists who are who are sort of far removed from whatever we're experiencing. You know, it's like the old like choose your own adventure, where they're like, you are the adventurer. You know, you sort of like you put yourself in that position where you almost become the protagonist in your own film, effectively.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting genre, and the neat thing about it is typically you can do it with anything. You could do it if you're just playing Dungeons and Dragons, because what you did with your Smoke and Snow campaign, you're able to try to work that in a little bit with your regular Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Yeah, well, I mean with that was the case of me going like, oh, I like the idea of the conflict. Obviously not like, but I find it interesting, you know, the conflict of people sort of emigrating to a country and then sort of butting heads with the people who are already there and the potential conflicts that can create. But obviously not wanting to pick a real world, sort of seem like I'm making light of like real world stuff like that, just translating a similar set of circumstances, but into an entirely fictional world. So it allows us to explore those potential conflicts, those clashes, and in some cases, those sort of friendships that were forged and the sort of joining of forces of people, in some cases, without seeming like, you know, we're making light of anything in the real world, but it's still an interesting thing to explore.
Right. Yeah, I think I tend to find that horror RPG is not the same fun experience that a horror movie is. Either you're too invested in your character, or I'm too invested in my character and get upset when it gets killed, or you're so uninvested in the character that you don't enjoy playing the game anyway, because you know they're just going to get killed. And it's a lot harder to build that horror suspense that you need to sell it in an RPG, because in the real world, if I'm walking across the park at night and then I realize there's something following me, I'm going to shit myself and run. In a horror movie, I realize there's something following me. I'm going to try and start walking a little bit quicker and start walking a little bit quicker. And the music's going to get slowly spookier and the suspense is going to build and build and build. In an RPG, I realize something's following me. I pull my sword out and I chin it. You know, it's a very different thing.
Well, it is. And that's interesting. So in a previous episode of Cerebrivore, a couple weeks ago, we talked about trying to do serious horror. And that's an interesting episode because we intentionally separate out the idea of the pulp horror that most horror games are, where you're going to pull your sword out to try to play into, you know, how to get the buy-in from the players to play that serious game where you're, you know, doing the genre expectations. But it takes a special group to do that, right?
Yeah, even as a character that hasn't got a sword, I've still got a combat stat right there on a piece of paper that tells me how likely I am to be able to fight this thing. Whereas on my own, walking across the park at night in the real world, I know I've got no combat stats. In a horror movie, it doesn't matter what my combat stats are because that big gribbly's scarier. In an RPG, in order to balance that RPG, I know that there's got to be some chance of us taking that monster out.
Well,
you know?
I think as well, like the thing about the horror RPGs, and obviously, I know we've got a little bit off topic, but with horror RPGs, there's certain like tropes that we all know from horror films. You know, the common tropes, like the guy who's like, "Oh, I'm just going outside. I'll be right back," or someone who's like, "Oh, the circuit breaker's gone. Oh, I'm going to have to go down to the cellar and replace the fuses." And when you watch a film, you're like, "Well, that guy's dead. He's not coming back. He's getting got." But and that's part of the enjoyment of horror for me. You know, you recognize these sort of things, and they are sort of comforting in a way because you sort of know what's going. And obviously, people can twist those or they can subvert those expectations. And if that's done well, that can be really cool by showing a contrast as this is what's happened and this is what you expected to happen. But in a horror game, for me, it's almost more fun to sort of play into those tropes. So if I'm playing in like a Call of Cthulhu game that someone's reading for you, if I come across like a spooky book that's bound in a strange leather with a face on it, you better believe I'm going to be like cracking it open and reading it. But because, and like obviously in real life, I've seen horror film. We all go like, "Oh, if this happened in real life, I've seen horror films. I wouldn't do this." But in a horror game, that's sort of part of the fun of it. Like, so like, I'm always quite happy to be the guy who's like, "Oh yeah, I just nip down in the cellar and change the lights." because but if everyone sort of buys into that, it's good fun, because even though you know, like, oh yeah, I might get killed by some horrible creature in the cellar or whatever when I go to change the light bulb, that's part of the fun. You're sort of buying into it, but you have to have a whole group of people who are willing to buy into it to really make a horror game fun. And even then, it's a different experience from watching a horror film, but you can still have a lot of fun with it. But like I said, everyone's really got to be into it. It's comparatively easy to run a standard sort of faux medieval D&D game. And that's no shade on D&D. I love my D&D, but it's easy enough for people to be like, oh yeah, we're playing fantasy sort of archetypes where we're going to fight like the Orc Warlord or whatever. Let's get our swords and our spells and let's go. Whereas with a horror film, with a horror RPG, you have to be willing to sort of push that suspension of disbelief a little bit further and say, yeah, I know this isn't the optimal thing to do. I know this probably isn't that realistic, but within the genre of horror, this is the sort of thing that would happen.
Right. And in a lot of games, like Dead of Night is one that I talked about in a System Sunday last month. Dead of Night rewards you when you buy into those genre expectations.
Yeah.
And a lot of these games do. Slash Reflect does that. A number of these games do. You know, they'll give you the players bennies or points, survivor. They reward the player for buying into the X. But yeah, it's definitely it's a totally different mindset, and it can't replicate a horror movie, right? I mean, it's just something totally different. But you can kind of try, because effectively you're making your own movie. So as you go. So
as we sort of said at the start, I mean, one of the things about true crime, horror films, stuff like that is we're sort of viewing this potential sort of darkness, these horrible events, from a position of relative comfort and safety. And obviously the same is true of an RPG. You can be as immersed as you want in a game, but there's never really a point when you forget that you're sat in your lounge around a table with your friends, or you're in a Zoom call or whatever, playing a game. And you can reach points where you can push that to the back of your mind and go like, oh yeah, I've suspended my disbelief that we're playing a game and I'm really into it. And you can sort of push it to the back of your mind. I'm going to just allow myself to momentarily sort of forget the fact that I'm sat here comfortably in an armchair playing an RPG. But like you say, you're still sort of removed from what's going on. So I think in that way, it's quite similar to a horror film, because you're getting the same thing. You're enjoying experiencing the strangeness and the darkness and stuff like that, but you're still doing it from this position of comfort. But there's slight differences in the experience.
Well, it's more interactive, right?
Yeah, of course.
That's the big part. But I want to be precious to everybody's time, and I know we didn't necessarily get around. Did Spencer? Did you have anything else that?
So a couple of films I wanted to recommend. A couple of other films I wanted to recommend. One that definitely qualifies as folk horror is The Ritual from 2017, a British horror film directed by David Bruckner, starring Rafe Spall. I don't want to get too much into the plot, but basically a group of friends go on a walking holiday in Sweden. They stray from the path. They take what they think is a shortcut through the forest. It isn't. They get lost, but something finds them. And there's certainly some genuinely disturbing scenes in this one, I thought. Anyway, I thought this was a really, really good film. I also want to recommend She Will from 2021, another bright British horror film directed by Charlotte Colbert. I think it's her directorial debut, starring Alice Krieg, featuring Malcolm McDowell as a sleazy film director. She's a former actress who goes to a healing retreat in Scotland after some surgery. The place she's staying in has soil that's rich in nutrients because so many women were burned there for being witches in the past. And this kind of ash-filled land starts having strange effects on her. And I thought it was a very, very interesting film with some really. It's not the scariest movie you'll ever see, but it certainly has a very unsettling atmosphere, some strange dream sequences, and definitely has a touch of the folk horror about it.
Very nice. Anything else?
I just wanted to quickly point out that I don't know if you're familiar with Grizzly Peaks Radio, but I'm involved in a group there who we play Call of Cthulhu, and generally as a group we kind of lean into the comedy of that, but we did try our hands at doing a serious horror scenario, and that's currently being, I think the first episode is out at the moment. And we entered into that with the mind that we'd probably be picked off through the adventure, and it's very much playing it with the listener in mind. So kind of trying to approach it with a radio play mentality, I guess.
Oh, nice.
But whether we pull that off or not is we yet to see.
I was going to say, I remember having a discussion about Call of Cthulhu with a friend of mine who was like not a fan of it, and was like, but you can't win in Call of Cthulhu because obviously you can't beat any of these eldritch like ancient entities or whatever. No, of course you can't. And I can sort of see the point, because if you want to play like your D&D and you're like, yes, we've beat the Orc Warlord, we've got the treasure, we've rescued the village, etc. I can sort of understand that, but it's a different kind of fun. Where I always go into a Cthulhu game expecting like, oh, I'm going to be the guy who's like, oh, my car won't start, and then gets dragged out of a window by like something horrible. But again, sort of emulating these sort of films and trying to sort of tell a version of these tales, but within the parameters of like a role play game. To me, that can still be great fun, even if my character's the one who gets like picked off by the strange dark shape just beyond the street lamp in like the first 5 minutes of the game.
Right. No, that's 100%. Any other last things before we let everybody go?
Just wanted to thank James for bringing Tam Lin to my attention. I really enjoyed that. I wasn't aware of it at all, and I'm glad I checked that out. It was a really, really good film, and it's a shame that Roddy McDowall didn't go on to direct anything else, because I think he's a real talent there.
Yeah, that is a good one. I just want to say thanks, and I also wanted to let the people that are listening after the fact know that Hannah's been wearing a totally awesome hat.
It's cold up here.
Yeah, we're trying to do our bit to keep our ridiculous energy bills down by only turning on our heating when it's necessary. So Hannah sat here wearing one of those like Russian army hats. But I suppose the only thing I'd say in closing was, as James has kindly pointed out when he mentioned these documentaries about folk horror, there is I know we touched on this. There is a vast array of stuff from various different countries and sort of regions of origin. And like I said, before watching some of these documentaries, I certainly wasn't aware of a lot of them. So I would urge you, if you are interested in folk horror, probably don't do what I first did, which was just like stick with the sort of the lore, go out watching these documentaries, read some of these books, which I'm sure will be on the list that James is going to make available. Go out and have a look at these, and you'll be surprised by how many similarities there are between like these universal tales, but also how each sort of region, each sort of place and people bring their own sort of different spin on these things. And there's just such a vast array of it out there. I really would encourage you to delve into it and do a bit of research. Again, step outside your comfort zone, I suppose, with this sort of thing.
Yeah, and at the bottom of my list, which Jason will share, someone, because it's the internet, on IMDb, someone has already made an IMDb list of every film that's mentioned in that documentary, and it's 235 films, and you can sort them in various different ways. So that is, because I was originally like, am I going to really sit here and watch the credits as all the film goes by? And then I was looking at one of the other films I was watching on IMDb, and I was like, wait a minute, there's literally already a list of all of these on IMDb. So yeah, if you go to the bottom of my list, it's linked in there. Along with, I also included a movie list that's pretty good and a couple of BFI lists. So yeah, there's plenty of stuff.
Excellent. Hannah, any last thoughts?
You put me on the spot there. I don't know what to say. Horror movies good. Folk horror, if it's not for you, there's many other genres of horror.
Definitely.
Yep, 100%. So thank you, everybody, for joining me this evening and recording this.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for hosting, Jason. And it's been great talking to you guys. Thank you.
Oh, no,
Much
no
appreciated.
problem. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks. Take care.
Hey everybody, Jason again. Just want to say that James's Google Doc is linked in the show notes. Check it out. It has all kinds of great goodness in there. Links to everything not everything we talk about in the show, but many, many things that we talked about in the show. The zombie movie that John was in, Zombie Hood from 2013, you can find on YouTube. If you have the Tubi streaming service, actually it doesn't cost anything. You can just go online and sign up for a free account. I don't even know if you have to sign up for an account. I think you can just watch it online. But if you Google Tubi, Tubi, Zombie Space Hood, it'll pop up there as well. So you can check that out. And like I say, there are links to everybody's information in the show notes. Thank you for joining us for this wonderful conversation. I look forward to hosting another panel next week. Take care.
Broadcast, Cerebral podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the sign of Capstrong. All styles and pods past, Cerebral podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Zombies grinding teeth, oh suicide in your brain. What I mean is this exchange of fake. From what I understand, don't look now, the Super Bowl is coming, and all that's left is the crying and the running. You can bring it, we've been high on the